Okay, so introduction to the Old Testament. Today's the 10th of February already. We're in the books of the law. We've done the introduction to the Pentateuch. Then we did book of Genesis. And now we're in the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, we saw the nature and the date of Exodus, saw some information associated with whether it's 15th century or 13th century. Bible basically points to 15th century, and you have people who try to make it 13th century, and I went through the information associated with that. Then we got into subpoint B, where we talked about literary analysis, got some information associated with the structure. We're still in B, by the way. Some information associated with the structure, and we saw different ways of looking at it. You can look at it from a location-based perspective, and then the outline would have Israel in Egypt, and then Israel in the wilderness, and finally Israel at Sinai. Or you can look at it from content. And content-based tells us that the first part is God saves Israel from Egyptian bondage, and that's where we're in right now, as a matter of fact. Then God gives Israel his law, and finally God commands Israel to build the tabernacle. And so there's different ways to look at it depending on which you want to emphasize, okay? We started then into using the second structure. We saw that this book is the most action-filled book. Chapter 1 states the problem being that the Israelites have gotten so large in their population that they're actually threatening the Egyptians. The Egyptians are concerned that there's too many of them, and we saw that the Pharaoh had the delivery of the children, had asked the, not nursemaids, but what am I trying to think of? Midwives, thank you. Midwives to execute the kids as they were being born, particularly the males. And of course, the midwife that delivered Moses didn't do that. And then we see in chapter 2, we see Moses. And then chapters 3 and 4 are transitional. They're essentially Moses meeting with God and getting instructions from God. We saw the burning bush. We saw the information associated with the burning bush out of this area. And we see that Moses is keep saying, basically, I'm not qualified to do this. I don't speak very well. I don't want to do it. And so finally God says, fine, I'm going to give you your brother, Aaron. And Aaron is going to be the one that is going to be the mouthpiece, and you're going to be the one that's going to be the leader. Give you a little bit of an overview of the area so we can see what we're talking about. And what we're talking about primarily is this area here, the land of Goshen, is primarily where the capitals were, and because that's basically the capital right there. And you have the Jews in that particular area. Okay, and when we're in the area where we're talking about the plagues, and there's going to be a reference to Heliopolis, so you can kind of remember where that is relative to all of this. So I'll give you previews of coming attractions. Okay.
About where did they actually cross the Red Sea? You've got that little piece up there that's close to where they were.
So there's no indication of exactly where, right? You know, the guess is up here close to the top. You have the whole concept of whether it's the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, right? And the Reed Sea comes from the Hebrew actually, and the Red Sea comes from the Septuagint. So you have a lot of people that are saying it wasn't the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea. And the Reed Sea is actually a big marsh area that was a bunch of lakes that was located right here. And so if you look at that path, what it says is they came out and then they actually came down around this way, and then they wandered around here to finally get to Mount Sinai, right? If they cross the Red Sea, then they come out and they come across, somewhere across here, and then they come down to Mount Sinai. Okay? Yep. Okay? And we saw that chapter 5 through 12 are the struggles with the Pharaoh and the associated plagues. We saw in chapter 1 that Moses and Aaron approached the Pharaoh. In point 1, chapter 5. Moses and Aaron approach the Pharaoh and try to get the people released. And Pharaoh says, no. And then God responds to Moses, and God reiterates who he is. We see in chapter 5 that God says essentially that he is the I am. He is the God of the universe, basically. And then God is going to show Egypt who he is. Okay? So we're in 7b, 2e, 3a. Okay, 7b, 2e, 3, and we start into the plagues. Okay, and so point 3 basically said, chapter 7 opens with a very important point. God tells Moses, see, I make you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. And so we see that Egypt is polytheistic, and the Pharaoh himself is considered to be a god. So in this statement, God is stating that through Moses, he is going to show that he is greater than their pantheon. And I know pantheon is really associated with the Greeks, but the idea is multiple gods, including the Pharaoh and all of his magicians. And this is clear when I gave you some information associated with Aaron's staff and the magician's staff and things like that. And then we got into subpoint A. We saw the first plague was blood. We saw that the Nile was turned into blood, and that's chapter 5, verses 15 through 25. Judgment upon the river, that's deified on occasion as Hapi, H-A-P-I, or Hapi, the giver of life, which causes the annual flooding of the Nile that deposited the rich silt in the fertile soil. So we see that we are starting to see the attacks on the Egyptian gods. Okay, and then in subpoint B, which was where we got last week with subpoint B, we saw the second plague is frogs, and that's chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. Said this too is a judgment against numerous gods of Egypt. In particular, the frog was worshipped as a symbol of Heket. She is a Egyptian goddess of life, creation, childbirth, and fertility. She's often depicted as a woman with the head of a frog, or the frog at the end of the phallus, or simply just a frog. And this is because frogs symbolize life and fertility to Egyptians because of the annual inundation of the Nile, which brings forth the fertility. And this plague, God is showing that he is the real God of life, and he is sarcastically cramming their false God onto them and destroying life. Remember, the frogs came and they started to destroy everything, right? And finally they asked for the frogs to go away. Well, God didn't just take them away. The frogs died, and then they had to gather them up in piles, and they started to stink, right? And everything. And then we're going to get the next one, because now you got all these dead frogs around. It makes a lot of sense that the next thing's going to have to do with insects, right? But anyway, God removes the plague, and the Pharaoh hardens his heart and doesn't let the individuals go. So now we're ready to pick it up with subpoint C, and that's C with a single parent around it. That was a quick review. Yesterday, I forgot how sometimes Jack would do a review. Yesterday, we were listening to one of the Sunday tapes, and he did, I think it was almost 40 minutes of review. And then we had about 10 minutes or 12 minutes of class, and that was it, right? It was like, okay, either someone new had come in or, something had happened. Usually you can tell if someone's new because he'll talk about rebound, and he'll give you an idea of how rebound works. But anyway, he went into a review for a long time. And we were like, okay, we're going to get some more points. But it was good to get to review. Anyway, subpoint C, little c, with single parents around it. The third and fourth plagues, gnats and flies. And this is obviously chapter 8 still, it's 16 through 32. I should have put the 8 in front of it, I didn't, but it's chapter 8, verses 16 through 32. We have, again, divine miracles were performed. But based upon natural occurrences, period. Note that God is using naturally occurring actions to make his point, semicolon. He does this to clearly show that he, comma, as creator of heaven and earth, comma, has complete control over nature, and can make it do his will. So you've got to understand that he's dealing with a people whose entire religious structure is based primarily on gods that represent natural phenomena, and primarily those things that happen around the Nile River, right? They worship the Nile River, and they worship all of those things that come as a result of the natural ebb and flow of the river itself. And so he is doing this not only to show the Jews that he's God, but he's doing it to show the Egyptians that he is greater than their gods. The gods that they've been worshiping, as controlling nature, he is doing, he is taking natural phenomenon, okay, and doing these things and creating these plagues to show them that he is the creator and he controls nature. I mean, there's so many other things he could have done that would have been quote unquote miraculous, that would not have involved, natural phenomenon, but he's doing it to show that he is in control of nature, these things that they worship, okay? Continue the point. This is to show the Egyptians that he and no other controls all things, and you can underline all things, period. The gnats were most likely sandflies. Like I said, these are similar to the ones that we find at our beaches, for example. If you've ever been to a beach around here, right, and you've had these horrible gnats that come, they seem to fly about 5 to 6 inches off the sand, right, and they attack your ankles, and it's just horrible, right? That's what this was, right? Most likely. The gnats were most likely sandflies, and these stinging and these stinging insects in Egypt So they were most likely sandflies, and these stinging insects in Egypt, a lot easier to write than to say, were notorious for being aggressive, period. The flies, literally, quote, swarms, end quote, were other common pesky insects which plagued Egypt, period. It's just because of the translation down into English that sometimes we lose it and we get too specific and we tend to think of flies, like they were going to be horse flies or something like that. They basically just say the swarms. So we're not sure, what kind of flies they were, but whatever they were pretty nasty, right? It's sort of like when the Bible talks about Adam and Eve covering themselves with leaves. We always talk about a fig leaf. Nowhere in the Bible does it say anything about it being a fig leaf. Right? It could have been anything else, right? So we don't know, and so we don't know what kind of flies these were. The gnats, it does say gnats, but the flies, it just says swarms, okay? Continue the point. These judgments were a blow against the prestige of Isis, I-S-I-S, wife and sister of Osiris. Yeah, a little incest going on there. He was married to a sister. Wife and sister of Osiris, Osiris. Who was associated with the Pharaoh as being his seat of power, period. Osiris was worshipped as the god of the pharaohs. Okay. Sure. These judgments were a blow against the prestige of Isis, wife and sister of Osiris, who was associated with the Pharaoh as being his seat of power. Period. She is also considered, it's actually Isis is the one who's associated with Pharaoh. I'm sorry, I misspoke. She is also considered to be the goddess of the wind, comma, magic, comma, fertility, and rebirth, period. In addition, comma, it is an attack on Hathor, Hathor, comma, Egypt's foremost goddess, represented by the cow. Period. Our highest goddess is a cow. What a cow. She, give you a little bit more information here about Egyptian theology. She is daughter, so we're talking about Hathor. She is daughter of the sun god Ra, Ra. And it was believed that all other goddesses were forms of her, period. She was considered a protective goddess of women, especially pregnant ones, and therefore was linked to the mother of the Pharaoh. See, so the idea was the Pharaoh himself was considered to be a god, and so the idea was that his mother was could be considered to be one of the forms of Hathor. Could be considered to be one of either one of the lesser goddesses that was a form of Hathor or was protected by Hathor when then he was born. And so, what we have to look at is this to me is kind of fantastic, because what God is sarcastically saying is, this is to you and your mother, both, right? Yeah, no. It's like he's not only beating up the Pharaoh, he's beating up the Pharaoh's mom, right? Okay. Continue the point. There's just a couple more sentences here. In verse 14, we start to see the limits of the Egyptian magicians, comma, quote. So prior to this, everything that God did, the plagues that God created, the magicians for the Egyptians could duplicate to a lesser extent. You know, they could take water and they could turn a little bit of water into blood. They could take, you know, and cause frogs to come, okay? But they didn't, of course, they weren't able to do it to the extent that God did, but they did enough that the Pharaoh could say, oh yeah, well, you guys are just doing magic. You Jews just learned how to do magic while you're slaves or whatever, right? He was not going to be convinced by what was going on here. But here's what we have in verse 14. So in verse 14, we start to see the limits of the Egyptian magicians, comma, quote. The magicians, so this is from verse 14. Wait a minute, it's 18, I think. Verse 18. Is that correct, 18? Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. Yes. Okay. It says, quote, the magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, comma, but they could not, semicolon. So there were gnats on man and beast, period, end quote. And that's Exodus 8:18. God makes it clear that the Hebrews are his people. By only allowing the plagues to hit the Egyptians, period. That's brought out multiple times, but here the closest time is chapter 8, verses 22 and 23. But even with these plagues, comma, the Pharaoh does not relent, period. Okay, so, but even with these plagues, the Pharaoh does not relent, period. Of course, every time he starts to say, you know, I'll let you go, please, you know, take this away. And so Moses goes and pleads for the Pharaoh to God, and God takes him away, right? You know, and then the Pharaoh says, no, you're not going to go. Right? And then they start getting worse and worse. And what happens is the Pharaoh then starts trying to deal with, you know, make a deal with them and says, well, basically, first of all, well, I'll let your men go and worship, because that's what Moses is saying, is we want to go out and worship, right? And the Pharaoh says, well, I'll let your men go, and Moses says that's not enough, right? You know, he says, well, I'll let your men and your women go, but you keep kids. No, kids got to go too, right? And he says, okay, I'm going to let, you know, the men and the women and the kids go, and Moses says, yeah, but we're going to have to sacrifice, so we have to take our animals too. And so he keeps pushing and pushing, and the Pharaoh, you know, he keeps relenting, okay? So now we're in little d, d with single parens around it. So 7b, 2e, 3d. The fifth plague, colon, diseased / killed livestock. This is chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. this plague So this plague, comma, as well as the coming sixth plague, comma, were directed against Ptah, P-T-A-H, the god of Memphis, comma. Let me go back to the map and point out. So here's Memphis, okay? So we're going to get Memphis and we're going to get Heliopolis, okay? And of course we have these two cities is where they were making the bricks. And so this whole area is the area that's getting hit, okay? Okay, so this, this plague, as well as the coming sixth plague, were directed against Ptah, the god of Memphis, represented as a bull, comma, as well as other gods, you can put and goddesses, represented by the goat, ram, cow, etc. Ptah, P-T-A-H, is considered the god of creation, comma, and thus the Lord is showing the Pharaoh that he is the creator and can easily destroy the Egyptian false gods, period. In this plague, God takes into account Egyptians who through these plagues have been evangelized and allows them to bring in their stock before the plague hits. That shows us God's mercy and justice, period. You see, what's happened is in the first four plagues, okay, it hit the Egyptians and it didn't hit the Jews. In fact, none of these plagues obviously hit the Jews, but it hit the Egyptians, right? And you have to understand that these plagues didn't come. We tend to think of them as one day, then the next day, then the next day, then the next. They didn't happen sequentially day after day after day. Okay, there were time periods before the next plague would hit. Okay, so you'd have this thing that would hit with the frogs, right? They'd be jumping all around and everything, right? And then God, the Pharaoh says, "Go to God, and plead for me." He tells Moses, "Go to God and plead for me and stop the plague," right? So Moses has to go out, plead for him, all right? The plague stops, and they got to, like I said, clean up all those frogs and put them in, right? And they're dying and everything in a horrible state. Well, that's taken weeks, right? And then Pharaoh has some good long time to think about it, and then he retracts his decision, right? And so it comes back, and then there's another plague. Well, during that time period, you still have the Jews as slaves, still working for the Egyptians, right? And so they're still in Egyptian households as slaves. They're still making bricks. They're doing all those things, right? And you're undoubtedly going to have Egyptians that are going to go to the Hebrews and saying, "What in the heck is going on? Why is this happening?" Right? And there's going to be evangelization that takes place, because Israel is becoming the first priest nation, right? They're being set up to be the priest nation, so they're being set up to be able to do evangelization. And so they're evangelizing these Egyptians. And so God says, to tell these Egyptians that those of them that bring in their stock before this plague hits, their stock will not be killed, right? And the Bible makes a point of bringing out that there were several that said, "No, don't you do that. You keep your stock out there. You'll be fine." Right? Okay, so he brings out that there were unbelievers, but he gave those who had been evangelized a chance to bring their stock in, which undoubtedly some of them did. Right? But what the Bible basically talks about is the ones who didn't. Well, their stock got killed. Okay? So that's his mercy and his justice. He's allowing these individuals to become believers, right? To convert. And those that convert, after seeing all these plagues and realizing that their gods aren't gods at all, okay, he allows them the opportunity. Okay? Subpoint little e. The sixth plague, boils. Chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. They aren't as common nowadays, I don't think, as they used to be, but when I was a kid, I had a problem with styes. I used to get styes on my eyelids, right, infected eyelids, that were horrible, right? Every school picture I ever had up through about the 7th grade, I had a stye in my eye. Sometimes I had two, right? Well, I got styes. My brother would get boils. My brother, and they were horrible, right? It's like, imagine getting a pimple only about 10 times larger, right? And they would turn purple and fester and all kinds of things, right? A lot of it was associated with having some of the allergies that we had, right, in the area that we lived in, okay? But you would get these things. They are no fun. Let me tell you, one of them is enough, okay? If you've ever had a very large, not to get too gross, but a very large pimple, right, and tried to get the core out of it, and the amount of pain that you tend to go through when that happens, a boil is much worse, and the core is about the size of a small kernel of corn, right, coming out of a pore in one of your skin. Very, very, very painful, okay? So the sixth plague, boils, chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. This plague is described as festering boils breaking forth as pustules. Hope you didn't have too much dinner. As pustules, that's Pustules, comma, upon man and beast. So that hit the people and their animals, okay? This was directed against both idolaters and the idols they worshipped. So if they still had some animals that didn't die with a disease and being killed, then these animals got, pustules, right? Yeah. Once again, the Lord is showing his power and dominion over all things, period. He takes a well-known affliction or skin disease, noted historically as the, quote, Nile scab, end quote. In extra-biblical literature, comma, which occurred as a result of the normal rising and falling of the Nile, comma, so what you have is the Nile not only flooded and brought in, the silt and stuff that caused the land to be fertile, but also when it receded, it left a marshy area, right? And when you have the marshy area, you have all these insects, and you have other diseases and stuff that come with the mold and all of those kinds of things that are associated with damp ground and things like that. That tends to lead to skin diseases. You get mosquitoes, malarial mosquitoes. You get all kinds of things that cause these pustules, these diseases, right? That were called the Nile scab. You would have all kinds of skin diseases associated with the onset of insects and some of the other stuff that happens when you're around those marshy kind of areas, right? So there was a thing, it's noted historically as being called the Nile scab, okay, and that's, when I say extra biblical literature, that's obviously literature that's outside of the Bible, okay, which occurred as a result of the normal rising and falling of the Nile, comma, magnifies it, and spreads it to all of the Egyptians, period. See, some of it was associated with oil, oily skin associated with the weather, with the moisture, right? Part of why we had, boils and styes and things like that, I think were associated with the fact that, being Italian, it tended to have body oil, right? And so when you would get a boil, one of the treatments was to put on a salve that was a drying salve, like a mud pack type thing, and it would pull out all of the moisture associated with the thing, dry it up, and eventually it would burst. And that's what I'd have to put like on my eyes for my styes, and my brother would have to do it for his boils, and one of them was called a carbuncle, which is like a double boil. But anyway, too much information about my family. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, magnifies it and spray. It was tough. I do remember one time going to I was wearing an eye patch because what would happen was I had two. I had one on the top lid and one on the bottom lid, and they would get really swollen and they turn yellow and all this stuff, right? And every now and then they would burst. My mom would try and put hot packs on them so that they would do it at home, right? But when I'd go to school, what my mom would do is I'd end up going to school with an eye patch so it didn't look quite so bad, because otherwise it looked like someone had beat you up really bad and everything like that, right? And so I was a smart aleck kid. Imagine that. I was a smart aleck kid, and I felt this thing burst, during class, and so I went up to the teacher and I asked if I could go to the nurse, and she said, "Why? I think you're fine. I think you're just trying to get out of whatever whatever was going on, right? Said, you need to, you don't need to go to the nurse. And I lifted up the eye patch, and this whole thing of blood just came right down the side of my face, along with pus and all kinds of other stuff that came out, right? And she fainted. so, so I went to the nurse, and I said, by myself, and I said, the teacher's fainted. So, anyway, so it magnifies it and spreads it to all the Egyptians, period. Last sentence. God, comma, capital G, God, and not their idols, is in control of the earth, period. And of course, we have the same situation. I'm not going to repeat it here again, but you have the same situation. The Pharaoh's going to let him go, and he doesn't let him go. So, okay, subpoint F. The seventh plague. There's 10 total, by the way, in case you want to know where we're going. Okay, if you don't remember, there's 10 of them. The seventh plague, hail. That's chapter 9, verses 13 through 35. This plague from the sky see, so far we've been dealing with things that are earth created, right? We've got bugs and frogs and red rivers and things like that. Now all of a sudden you're going to have something come from the sky. This plague from the sky would impress the Egyptians, comma, who saw a deity behind every natural phenomenon, comma, that our God, am I going too fast? I'll slow it down. This plague from the sky would impress the Egyptians, who saw a deity behind every natural phenomenon, that our God is the Lord of heavens as well as earth, period. Hail is rare. In Egypt, comma, thus this would truly impress them as miraculous, period. This plague occurred most likely in January as indicated by the fact that the barley, so that's the fact that the barley, B-A-R-L-E-Y, and flax were in bloom, verses 31 and 32. So that particular region, that's when those grains bloom, is in January, usually mid to late January. So it probably happened sometime in January that this hail came down. Okay, and so that tells us, by the way, that there's some duration between these plagues, because if this happened in January, right, and Passover doesn't happen until it's equivalent to our Easter, right? So like in April, right? So you have January, February, March, you got a couple months before you finally get to Passover, which of course is going to be the plague associated with Passover is the death of the firstborn. That's the 10th plague. Okay, and we're right now on the 7th plague. We have 2 more plagues, and then you have the death of the firstborn. So there's a couple, there's some time periods that are going on in between here. That's why we know it didn't happen day after day after day. Okay, so this plague occurred in January, as indicated by the fact that the barley and flax were in bloom, verses 31 and 32. Note that this will affect not only their food source, but their source of clothing as well. Period. The hail came down and destroyed all the barley and flax that were in bloom. So they were about ready to harvest these grains. The barley obviously is used for food. They also had quote barley wine, which is beer, right? That they would make make with it, which was used in ceremonies. So you had ceremonial alcohol and things that was getting destroyed. And then you had the flax that was destroyed, from which they made clothes, okay, and things like that. That's where linen comes from, is flax, if you don't know that, okay. And so their linen supply was going to be suffering, and all of this happened, right, because the hail came down and just pulverized all of this stuff that was in bloom. Okay, like when we have our weird weather, and I see my fruit trees have all of these wonderful blooms on it, and then we get this weird rainstorm that comes and wind, and it knocks off all the blooms. And it was warm the day before, and then it's ice cold, and we get this rain and knocks off all the blooms, and then it's warm again, but the fruit tree doesn't bloom again, right? So you don't get any fruit. But anyway, that's what was happening here. Okay, the hail came down, and it was a surprise to them because hail was not normally something that occurred at this time of the year. Okay, continue the point. This plague would have certainly discredited the Egyptian goddess Nut, N-U-T, also known as Neuth, that's N-E-U-T-H, and Nuit, N-U-I-T. It's all here, Neuth, Nuit. By the way, her name is where we actually get the root for the English words night, nocturnal, equinox. All of those come from Nut. Okay? Continue the point. Nut is one of the most important goddesses in Egypt. And is a member of the Ennead, that's E-N-N-E-A-D, comma, So Nut is one of the most important goddesses in Egypt and is a member of the Ennead, or group of 9 deities who were worshipped at Heliopolis. Helio, Heliopolis. Heliopolis. That's obviously a Greek name meaning the city of the sun, right? Anyway, Heliopolis. Nut, comma, in Egyptian religion, comma. So Nut, comma, in Egyptian religion, comma, a goddess of the sky, comma, is often depicted as a woman arched over the earth god Geb, or Geb, G-E-B. That's that last name there, Geb. Okay, so she's the goddess of the sky, and where's this hail coming from? It's coming from the sky, right? And what's interesting is most cultures of regions where the rain is personified, the sky is actually masculine, the rain being the seed which fertilizes Mother Earth. Okay, but in Egypt, the rain plays no role in fertility, because fertility and all the useful water comes from earth, or the Nile, right? So Egyptian religion is unique in that the genders of the deities of earth and sky, okay? She's a goddess of the sky, which normally is a god, and the god of the earth in Egyptian religion is Geb, this other person, who is a god, and he's male. And normally we have Mother Nature. We have female for earth, right, and male for sky. And in Egypt, it's flipped the other way, okay? Just thought that was interesting. Thought I'd give it to you guys. Anyway, continue the point. As the goddess of the sky, Nut swallowed the sun in the evening and gave birth to it again in the morning. On 5 special days, preceding the new year, Nut gave birth successively to 5 other deities. And these deities are Osiris, Horus, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys, okay? The idea is, though, she gave birth to these deities before the new year. So what's happening is the hail didn't come until after the new year. Here we're talking about the new year as it occurs in the Gregorian calendar, okay? Talking about in the January time frame. So she's the goddess of the sky, and she gives birth to these other deities, these other 5 deities on their special days, right? And our Lord waits until after all 5 of these are supposed to have been born, and he brings forth hail to show that he has control of the skies. Okay? She was originally, I'll give you some more information you don't need to write down, but she was originally the goddess of the day sky, a place where the clouds were formed, but then as time went by, she evolved into the personification of the whole sky and the heavens. So at this point in time, she's considered to be the goddess of the sky and heavens. Okay? Continue the point. We can see that the fact that God made it hail which of course would normally and I put normally in quotes, be the domain of Nut, normally from the perspective of the Egyptian, right? Which of course would normally be the domain of Nut, is a direct attack on Nut's authority over the sky. And I was hopeful that we might be able to make it through most of these. We have through most of them, but I was hoping we could finish it up tonight. We're not going to be able to. The eighth plague, okay, is going to be locusts. And so what happens is the Bible is very clear and tells us that the barley and the flax was in bloom when the hail came down, but the wheat wasn't. Okay, and then we have the wheat coming into bloom. And so you can see them saying, well, we don't have any barley, we don't have any flax, but at least we got wheat, right? And whoof, here come the locusts, and they're going to wipe out all the wheat. Okay, so this is going to happen. Okay, and so then we have that will be the eighth plague. The ninth plague is going to be darkness, and then of course the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. And I'm spending some time on these because they're so important in showing how God has made war, if you will, against these Egyptian gods. And he's not only showing the Hebrews that he is God, that he is going to allow them to leave Egypt and trying to give them confidence, okay? But he's also showing the Egyptians and the surrounding areas that he's God. So we're starting to see the evangelization and the formation, like I say, of the priest nation Israel as evangelists. Because now, whenever they go, when they start to go into the promised land, okay, after they do all their wandering in the desert and the generation dies off, right? There's a lot of years between there, right? They go for, because how long do they wander in the desert, right? 40 years, right? So even 40 years later, as they go into the promised land, the various races that are in the promised land remember that these are the people that are associated with the God that took out all the gods of Egypt, right? And so they're somewhat reticent or afraid to go up against these Israelites. So God is making a very, very worldwide point through these. So that's why I'm going through them and giving you some background as to who the various gods were that he was attacking, because many times we don't ever see this. The Bible doesn't come out and say, oh yeah, now our God is making fun of this God, right? You have to do a little bit of research to figure that out. And so we'll get through the 10th plague, the 10 plagues, and then we'll get to, of course, them getting released. And what happens? They get up against the Red Sea. And then you have, once again, the attitude, the fantastic attitude of faith in God, represented by the Israelites who go to Moses and say, why did you lead us out of Egypt? Were there not enough graves in Egypt? You're going to lead us out here to die? Anyway, that's where we're going to go. Okay. So we'll go ahead and end tonight with this last plague that we did. Okay. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to continue to study your word and the information associated with your word, to get a better understanding of everything that you were teaching and of everything that you were showing, and to have the fantastic confidence of you being the God of the universe and the God that can handle everything and anything that's going to come our way. And for that, we are truly grateful. We ask now that God, the Holy Spirit, take this information, make it understandable and real to us, so we can use it properly as we go forward in our day-by-day walk with you. And we pray in Christ's name. Amen.